the smell of hot iron mixed with sweat and blood in the stormy dawn of August 30th, 1800. Gabriel Prosser knelt in the red Virginia mud, his wrists cut by thick ropes that the militia captain had tightened until they severed circulation. Rain fell like bullets over Richmond, transforming the earth into a bloody quagmire that reflected the trembling torches of the soldiers. At 24 years old, the county's most feared blacksmith knew he was living his last hours of freedom, but his black eyes still burned with the fury of one who had touched the sky with his fingers. "You arrived too late," he spat blood onto the soaked ground, looking directly into the frightened blue eyes of Captain James Monroe. "The fire has already begun to burn, and you cannot extinguish what is already in the souls of men." The officer took 2 steps backward, his hand instinctively seeking the saber's hilt. Everyone present knew that Gabriel was not speaking only of literal flames. For 18 long months, his forge had been much more than a workplace for shaping horseshoes and nails. It was the pulsing, secret heart of a conspiracy that planned to incinerate Virginia's capital in a single bloody night and liberate all the state's slaves in a holy war that would shake the foundations of the South. More than 1,000 men had sworn to follow him to death. Razor-sharp machetes, axes forged in secret during silent dawns, torches soaked in whale oil and pitch waited for the signal that would never come. "Tell your masters," Gabriel continued, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade through flesh, "that a slave almost burned their city to ashes. Tell them that Gabriel Prosser was one night away from transforming Richmond into a funeral pyre for slavery itself." "Shut your mouth, Negro!" screamed a young soldier, whose voice cracked with terror. But the captain raised his hand, silencing him. He knew this was no ordinary slave. Gabriel measured nearly 6.5 feet tall, muscles forged by years of working iron under the merciless Virginia sun. More dangerous than his physical strength was his mind. He could read, write, and quote scripture from memory, transforming biblical verses into war cries that echoed through the slave quarters like thunder. "The Lord brought the children of Israel out of Egypt," Gabriel murmured, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Richmond slept in false security. "And we are today's children of Israel, crying out for deliverance from this house of bondage." The betrayal had come from within, as Gabriel had always feared it might. 2 slaves, Tom and Pharaoh, had run to their masters on the eve of the uprising, revealing every detail of the plan with trembling voices and tears of terror. The storm had done the rest, flooding roads and delaying the march that should have begun at midnight with the precision of a military operation. But Gabriel showed neither repentance nor surprise at the failure. "You can hang me," he said, as the soldiers lifted him from the ground, chains clanking like funeral bells. "But you cannot kill an idea whose time has come. Richmond will burn one day. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but it will burn. And when it does, remember the name Gabriel Prosser." The captain ordered him taken to the city jail. As they walked through the empty streets, Gabriel looked at each house, each illuminated window, each symbol of white prosperity built on black suffering. He knew that behind those walls, white families would sleep restlessly for generations to come, their dreams populated by slaves in revolt, their children raised on nightmares of black rebellion. His rebellion had failed, but the terror was already planted in the collective consciousness of Virginia. "My hammer forged more than iron," he whispered to himself as they approached the jail. "It forged the fear that will last for generations, and fear is the first step toward freedom." The blacksmith Gabriel Prosser had been born a slave on Thomas Henry Prosser's plantation, 15 miles northwest of Richmond, in the heart of Henrico County. It was 1776 when he entered the world. The same year the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men were created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The bitter irony was not lost on Gabriel when he learned to read years later, discovering that the founding document of American freedom had been written by men who owned hundreds of slaves. His name had not been chosen by accident. Master Prosser, a religious and contradictory man who read scripture while counting his human property, had given him the name of the archangel who announced divine messages to mankind. He did not know he was baptizing the messenger of his own destruction. From childhood, Gabriel distinguished himself among the other slaves, not merely through the height and strength that made him appear older than his years, but through the sharp intelligence that absorbed knowledge like incandescent iron absorbs the hammer's blow. Thomas Prosser, needing a qualified blacksmith to service his plantation and the surrounding county, decided to train the boy in the ancient art of metalworking. "You have large hands," he said on the day Gabriel turned 12, examining the boy's already massive palms. Hands that can shape metal to our will. But remember, boy, you are my metal to shape, now and always. Gabriel merely nodded obediently. But inside, a spark ignited that would grow into a conflagration. If he could shape iron, why could he not shape destinies? The forge became his university, his temple, his sanctuary of secret knowledge. While other slaves labored in the tobacco fields under the scorching Virginia sun, breathing dust and suffering the overseer's lash, Gabriel worked with literal fire, learning the ancient mysteries of transforming raw ore into tools, weapons, and works of art. He learned that the strongest iron needed to be heated until it nearly melted before it could be molded into something new and useful. The lesson was not lost on him, and he applied it to his own soul. Years of humiliation, whippings, and injustices were heating his spirit until it reached the melting point where it could be reformed into something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. "Why do you always stare toward Richmond when you work?" asked Martin, an older slave who assisted in the forge and had become something of a father figure to Gabriel. It was the summer of 1798, and Gabriel had grown into an imposing man of 22, standing head and shoulders above most men, black or white, his massive frame corded with muscles earned through years of swinging heavy hammers. He was respected and feared in equal measure throughout the county, known for his skill at the anvil and his disturbing habit of staring toward the capital city during his breaks from work. "Because Richmond is where those who decide our lives reside," Gabriel replied without shifting his gaze from the city that glittered in the distance like a jewel of white supremacy. "One day, we shall decide theirs, and they will learn what it means to live at another man's mercy." Martin swallowed hard, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down his tools. He had known Gabriel for 6 years, and understood that the young man never spoke carelessly. Every word was forged like iron, heated in the fires of thought and hammered into shape by careful consideration. When Gabriel said something would happen, wise men prepared for its arrival. "That kind of talk could get us all killed," Martin whispered, glancing nervously toward the plantation house where Master Prosser sat on his veranda, sipping whiskey and counting the profits from their unpaid labor. Gabriel finally turned from his contemplation of Richmond, fixing Martin with those burning black eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. "We are already dead, Martin. We died the day we were born into chains. The only question is whether we will die as slaves or die as men fighting for freedom." The Prosser plantation housed more than 60 slaves in various states of misery and degradation. Gabriel knew each one by name, their personal histories, their scars both visible and hidden, their breaking points, and their secret dreams of escape. There was Nanny, barely 16 now, but already the mother of 2 children fathered by the overseer who had raped her repeatedly since she was 14. There was Ben, whose back bore the permanent ridged scars of 300 lashes received for attempting to run away to Pennsylvania, where he had heard black men lived as free citizens. There was Solomon, whose 10-year-old son had been sold to a plantation in South Carolina, torn from his father's arms, while both screamed and fought until the slave catchers beat them unconscious. Each injustice was another piece of coal feeding the fire that burned ever hotter in Gabriel's chest. Each crying child, each broken family, each casual brutality inflicted by white overseers was another degree of heat applied to the iron of his soul, until it reached the molting point where it could be transformed into something new. "God gave us muscles," Gabriel would say during the Sunday prayer meetings that slaves were permitted to hold in the plantation's tobacco barn. "He gave us brains capable of thought and planning. He gave us hearts that know the difference between right and wrong. Why would the Almighty bestow such gifts upon us if He did not intend for us to use them in the pursuit of freedom?" The assembled slaves would murmur, "Amen," and praise Jesus. But Gabriel could see in their eyes the same fire that burned in his own heart. His words echoed far beyond the boundaries of the Prosser plantation. At Young's Spring Tavern, where slaves were permitted to gather on Sunday afternoons and purchase rum with the few coins they earned from weekend labor, Gabriel's presence drew crowds that grew larger each week. Men traveled from plantations 20 miles away just to hear the tall blacksmith speak words that kindled hope in hearts long deadened by despair. "Brothers," he would say, his powerful voice carrying over the bowed heads of men who had never dared to dream of freedom. "You know the story of Moses, how he demanded that Pharaoh let God's people go. But Moses did not ask politely and accept refusal. He brought plagues upon Egypt. He brought death and terror and suffering to the oppressors until they begged the Israelites to leave. We are God's people, enslaved in a new Egypt. Richmond is our Pharaoh's palace. And I tell you truly, I am ready to be your Moses." These were not merely empty words designed to stir emotions and then fade into the hopelessness of Monday morning's return to the fields. Gabriel had begun to recruit systematically, carefully choosing men who showed both the intelligence to understand complex plans and the courage to act when action was required. First came his own brother Martin, 10 years older and more cautious by nature. A man who had learned to survive by keeping his head down and his opinions to himself. "You have lost your mind," Martin whispered when Gabriel first revealed his embryonic plans for armed rebellion. "They will kill us all, every man, woman, and child on every plantation in Virginia. They will make examples of us that will be remembered for 100 years. Gabriel grasped his brother's shoulder with one massive hand, feeling the trembling in the older man's muscles. "They are already killing us, Martin, one day at a time, one lash at a time, one broken family at a time. The only difference is that my plan gives us the chance to die as free men rather than live as slaves." Martin stared into his brother's eyes and saw something that both terrified and inspired him. Absolute determination married to careful intelligence. There was no doubt, no hesitation, no fear visible in Gabriel's expression. He had already calculated the odds, weighed the potential costs, and made his decision with the methodical precision he brought to his metalworking. Freedom was worth any price, including death. And if death was to be their portion, it would be death with honor, rather than the slow spiritual murder of continued enslavement. "What do you need from me?" Martin asked quietly, and Gabriel smiled for the first time in months. The second recruit was Jack Bowler, known throughout the county as Jack Ditcher for his unmatched skill at digging drainage ditches and irrigation canals. Jack was more pragmatic than Martin, a natural strategist who understood that successful rebellion required more than righteous anger. "How many men do you think you can gather?" he asked during a clandestine meeting in Gabriel's forge, speaking in whispers even though they were alone. Gabriel had spent months thinking about exactly this question, studying the demographics of Central Virginia and calculating the military potential of the slave population. Richmond had approximately 5,000 residents, roughly half of whom were enslaved. If he could mobilize just 1/3 of the adult male slaves in the city and surrounding counties, he would command a force of nearly 1,000 warriors. 1,000 men, Gabriel answered without hesitation. "Perhaps more, if word spreads as I expect it will." Jack whistled softly, his eyes widening with the implications. "And weapons?" Gabriel's smile was grim but confident. "Leave the weapons to me, brother. I am, after all, a blacksmith." During the months that followed, Gabriel's forge became a secret weapons factory operating under the cover of legitimate metalworking. Officially, he continued to craft horseshoes, nails, and agricultural tools for the plantation and neighboring farms, fulfilling his quota of productive labor while maintaining the facade of a docile, valuable slave. Unofficially, every hammer blow against the anvil was creating machetes, spearheads, and axes designed for war rather than farm work. Gabriel labored during the pre-dawn hours when the plantation slept, his massive frame silhouetted against the glowing forge fire as sweat streamed down his face and arms. The metal sang under his hammer as he shaped it into instruments of liberation, each weapon a prayer forged in iron and tempered in the flames of righteous anger. "Lord," he would murmur while he worked, quoting from Ecclesiastes in the King James Bible he had memorized word by word. "There is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for peace and a time for war." He paused in his hammering, holding up a freshly forged machete that gleamed like silver in the firelight. "The time for war has come, and I am your humble instrument, prepared to do whatever violence is necessary to set your people free." The weapon was perfect, its edge sharp enough to split hairs, its balance ideal for the terrible work ahead. Gabriel wrapped it carefully in oiled cloth and added it to the growing arsenal hidden beneath the forge's floorboards. The network of conspiracy grew like wildfire in dry grass, spreading from plantation to plantation through whispered conversations and secret handshakes, binding together men who had never dared to hope for anything beyond survival. George Smith, a house slave from the neighboring Wilkinson plantation, brought 12 men into the fold, each vetted through careful questioning about their commitment and discretion. Sam Bird, who worked as a coachman and therefore knew every road, bridge, and ford between Richmond and the surrounding countryside, joined the conspiracy with precious intelligence about troop movements and defensive positions. Watt, a remarkably educated slave who could read maps and had somehow learned the principles of military strategy, contributed detailed drawings of Richmond's layout, marking the locations of armories, government buildings, and the homes of prominent officials. Each new recruit brought others in an expanding network of revolutionary cells, and Gabriel insisted that the conspiracy maintain strict operational security to prevent discovery and betrayal. He had studied the failed slave revolts of the past, from Stono in South Carolina to the aborted conspiracies in New York, and he understood that lack of organization killed more rebellions than lack of weapons or courage. The movement was structured in cells of 10 men each, with only the cell leaders knowing the identities of members in other groups. If any conspirator was captured and tortured, he could not reveal more than a fraction of the total operation. "Clever," murmured Jack Bowler during one of their planning sessions. "Where did you learn such methods?" Gabriel looked at him with the intensity that had become his trademark. "From the Bible, brother. Jesus had 12 apostles, but only 3 were permitted to witness the Transfiguration. Even the Son of God understood that some secrets must be closely held. The plan that emerged from months of careful preparation was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential for destruction. On the chosen night, the conspirators would divide into 3 coordinated strike forces, each with specific objectives that would cripple Richmond's ability to resist or escape. The first group, led by Jack Bowler, would seize the city's main armory and powder magazine, securing weapons and ammunition for the larger force while preventing the authorities from arming civilian militias. The second group, commanded by Sam Bird, would simultaneously attack the warehouses and docks along the James River, setting fires that would create panic and prevent evacuation by water, while destroying the economic infrastructure that made Richmond profitable. The third and largest force, led by Gabriel himself, would march directly through the heart of the city to the governor's mansion, where they would capture Governor James Monroe and hold him hostage while demanding the immediate emancipation of all slaves in Virginia. "And if he refuses our demands?" asked a young recruit during one of the final planning meetings. Gabriel's response was delivered without hesitation or emotion, in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. "Then he dies, along with every other white man in Richmond who will not acknowledge our right to freedom. We will kill them all if necessary, from the governor down to the meanest overseer, until they understand that slavery ends tonight, one way or another." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Every man present understood that there would be no compromise, no negotiation, no middle ground between total victory and total defeat. The date was set for Saturday night, August 30th, 1800, chosen for maximum strategic advantage and minimum risk of discovery. Gabriel had calculated that Saturday evening would find most white families at home and relaxed after the week's work, with minimal military presence in the barracks and government buildings. The new moon would provide maximum darkness for the initial approach and assault, while Sunday's traditional day of rest would delay any organized counterattack until Monday morning, giving the rebels crucial time to consolidate their control of the city. "Brothers," Gabriel announced during the final General Assembly 3 days before the uprising, "the hour we have prayed for and prepared for has finally arrived. Richmond will burn with the fire of justice, and from its ashes will rise a new Virginia where no man owns another." More than 400 men attended that last meeting, filling the tobacco barn on a remote plantation where they could gather without arousing suspicion. The air was thick with excitement, determination, and the scent of oiled steel as each man checked his weapons one final time. But the gods of war and weather had their own plans for Gabriel's revolution. On the afternoon of August 30th, dark clouds began massing over central Virginia with ominous speed and intensity. What had begun as scattered showers quickly developed into a violent thunderstorm of unusual severity, with winds strong enough to uproot trees and rainfall that transformed every stream into a raging torrent. Rivers overflowed their banks within hours, washing out bridges and turning roads into impassable quagmires that would trap any army foolish enough to attempt movement. Gabriel stood at the window of his forge, watching his dreams being literally washed away by the storm, feeling for the first time since childhood the bitter taste of helplessness. "Perhaps this is a sign from the Almighty," whispered Martin, who had arrived soaked to the skin for what was supposed to be their final meeting before the attack. Gabriel turned toward his brother with fury blazing in his eyes like the forge fire itself. "A sign of what? That we should remain slaves forever? That God wants us to accept chains as his divine will?" But beneath his anger, a cold doubt was beginning to gnaw at the foundations of his faith and resolve. The most difficult decision of Gabriel's life had to be made in the span of minutes, with the lives of 1,000 men hanging in the balance. To proceed with the attack would mean sending his followers to certain death in the flooded roads and swollen creeks that lay between them and Richmond. To postpone risked discovery of the conspiracy and the execution of everyone involved. But it also offered the possibility of fighting another day when conditions favored success over martyrdom. Gabriel summoned the cell leaders to an emergency meeting in his forge, while the storm raged overhead like the wrath of an angry god. The rain hammered against the roof with the intensity of musket fire, and lightning illuminated the faces of men who had risked everything for this moment. "What are your orders, Gabriel?" asked Jack Bowler, water streaming from his hair and clothes. "Do we march tonight regardless of the storm, or do we wait for better weather?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the forge, and Gabriel felt the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had spent 2 years of his life preparing for this single night, forging weapons in secret, recruiting warriors from across Virginia, nurturing hopes that had sustained them all through the darkest hours of bondage. "We postpone," he said finally, the words tearing from his throat like broken glass. "1 week. When the roads are dry and the creeks have receded, Richmond will burn as we planned." The disappointment in the room was palpable, but every man understood the military logic behind the decision. But 1 week proved to be far too long. On the morning of Sunday, August 31st, Mosby Shepherd was awakened by frantic pounding on his door that shattered the peaceful silence of the Sabbath dawn. Tom, one of his most trusted house slaves, stood on the porch in a state of absolute panic, his eyes wide with terror and his voice shaking with the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Master," he stammered, barely able to form coherent words, "I got to tell you something terrible. About Gabriel Prosser and what he's planning. About Richmond and all the killing that was supposed to happen last night." In the hours that followed, the entire conspiracy was exposed in devastating detail as Tom revealed everything he knew about the secret meetings, hidden weapons, and plans to burn the city. Pharaoh, another slave from a neighboring plantation, corroborated every aspect of Tom's testimony, adding details about specific targets and the timing of the attacks. Within hours, riders were galloping along every road in central Virginia, carrying news of the conspiracy to every plantation owner, military commander, and government official in the region. Gabriel learned of the betrayal before sunset on that same Sunday, when one of his men who worked near the Shepherd plantation overheard the conversations and raced to warn his leader. The blacksmith received the news with neither surprise nor visible anger, merely nodding slowly as if he had always known this moment would eventually arrive. The expression on his face was one of profound sadness rather than rage, the look of a man who understood that human nature was as predictable as the behavior of iron under heat. "Gather everyone," he told Martin with quiet dignity. "We meet in the woods behind Brook Plantation one final time." When his followers assembled in the forest clearing they had used for so many planning sessions, they found Gabriel calmer and more composed than they had ever seen him. "Brothers," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the trees, "our war ends today, not as we planned, but as God wills. Some of you will be captured. Some will die. Remember this. We die as free men, not as slaves, and that makes all the difference in the world." The manhunt that followed was swift and merciless. Militia companies scoured every plantation, every forest, every barn and cellar in central Virginia, armed with detailed descriptions of the conspirators and authorization to shoot anyone who resisted arrest. Gabriel managed to evade capture for nearly 3 weeks. Moving through the network of safe houses and hideouts his organization had prepared for exactly this contingency. He could have fled to Pennsylvania or even to Canada where slavery had been abolished, but something kept him anchored to Virginia soil. Perhaps it was loyalty to the men who could not escape, or perhaps it was a stubborn refusal to abandon the land where he had been born and planned to die free. On September 25th, he was finally cornered near Norfolk while attempting to board a northbound ship, betrayed once again by a slave who hoped to earn his master's favor. Gabriel did not resist arrest, nor did he attempt to deny his identity or role in the conspiracy. He merely looked at the arresting officers and said with quiet dignity, "I am Gabriel Prosser, and I am ready to face whatever justice you think you can dispense." During the wagon ride back to Richmond, shackled hand and foot like a dangerous animal, he observed the familiar landscape of Virginia with the eyes of a man seeing his homeland for the last time. Every plantation they passed held slaves who had sworn to follow him into battle, and he wondered how many of them would follow him to the gallows instead. The irony was not lost on him that he was being transported to face trial in the very city he had planned to liberate through fire and sword. The trial was a foregone conclusion, a legal formality designed more to satisfy public curiosity than to determine guilt or innocence. Gabriel was charged with conspiracy to rebel and making war against the Commonwealth of Virginia, crimes that carried a mandatory sentence of death. He refused to enter a plea, declined the services of a court-appointed attorney, and maintained absolute silence throughout the proceedings except when directly addressed by the judge. His demeanor was one of dignified defiance rather than sullen defeatism, and even his enemies had to admit that he faced death with remarkable courage and composure. When Judge James Roane asked if he had anything to say before sentence was passed, Gabriel rose slowly to his full imposing height and spoke the words that would echo through history. "I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial by them. I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and am a willing sacrifice in their service." The courtroom fell silent at this comparison between the slave rebel and the father of American independence, and even the judge seemed momentarily stunned by the eloquence and audacity of Gabriel's final statement. On October 10, 1800, Gabriel Prosser was executed by hanging in Richmond, along with 25 of his most dedicated followers. The execution drew thousands of spectators, both black and white, who filled the streets surrounding the gallows in a carnival atmosphere that mixed morbid curiosity with political theater. Gabriel ascended the scaffold without assistance, refusing the traditional blindfold and declining the offer of last words from a minister. His final statement, delivered in a voice that carried across the silent crowd, was brief but memorable. "I go to my death as I lived my life, as a free man in my heart, if not in law." Let those who survive remember Gabriel Prosser, not as a slave who died, but as a man who lived free for one shining moment. The rope was adjusted around his neck, the trapdoor opened, and Gabriel Prosser passed into legend with the same dignity he had brought to life. But death was not the end of Gabriel's story. It was merely the beginning of his transformation from failed rebel into enduring symbol. Within weeks of the execution, stories about the blacksmith began spreading throughout the slave quarters of Virginia and beyond, growing in the telling until Gabriel became larger in death than he had ever been in life. Mothers in the senzalas told their children about the giant blacksmith who had muscles of iron and a heart of fire, who had dared to challenge the entire system of slavery with nothing but courage and righteousness. Fathers whispered to their sons about the day when 1,000 slaves had been ready to march for freedom, and how close they had come to success before nature and betrayal intervened. The legend grew with each generation, transforming Gabriel from a historical figure into a mythic hero whose spirit could never be chained or killed. The impact on Richmond was immediate and lasting. White families throughout the city began sleeping with loaded weapons beside their beds, jumping at every unexpected sound and viewing their slaves with new suspicion and fear. Laws were quickly passed to restrict slave movement, ban gatherings, and prohibit the teaching of reading and writing to bondsmen. Blacksmiths of African descent found themselves under constant surveillance, their forges inspected regularly for evidence of weapons manufacture. But these repressive measures only served to confirm what Gabriel had always believed, that the slave system was fundamentally weak, dependent on fear rather than legitimacy, and vulnerable to collapse if enough slaves found the courage to resist simultaneously. The ripple effects of Gabriel's conspiracy spread far beyond Virginia's borders, inspiring slave rebels throughout the South while terrifying their masters into increasingly draconian countermeasures. Denmark Vesey in Charleston studied the details of Gabriel's organization and methods, incorporating the lessons learned into his own elaborate conspiracy 3 decades later. Nat Turner, who would lead the most successful slave revolt in American history, acknowledged Gabriel as an inspiration and model, proving that the blacksmith's vision of armed resistance had not died with him on the gallows. Every subsequent slave rebellion carried within it a spark of the fire that Gabriel had kindled in his forge, and every slaveholder's nightmare was haunted by the specter of the tall blacksmith who had almost burned Richmond to the ground in pursuit of freedom. The historical record of Gabriel's conspiracy was systematically suppressed by Virginia authorities, who understood that detailed accounts of the rebellion might inspire imitators. Official documents minimized the scope and sophistication of the plot, describing it as the work of a few malcontents, rather than the carefully planned military operation it actually was. Newspapers throughout the South either ignored the story entirely, or dismissed it as evidence of why slavery needed to be more strictly regulated rather than abolished. But the suppression of historical truth could not erase the memory of what had almost happened, and Gabriel's name continued to circulate through the underground networks that connected slave communities across the American South. The broader significance of Gabriel's rebellion extended beyond its immediate impact on slavery in Virginia. It represented a fundamental challenge to the racial mythology that justified human bondage, proving that enslaved Africans were capable of sophisticated political organization, military planning, and coordinated resistance against their oppressors. The conspiracy revealed the lie at the heart of slavery, that Africans were naturally suited for bondage and incapable of the higher forms of thought and action. Gabriel himself embodied everything that white supremacist ideology claimed was impossible. A slave who could read and write, who understood complex political and military concepts, who could inspire and organize hundreds of followers, and who faced death with the same courage displayed by celebrated white patriots. The transformation of Gabriel from historical figure to cultural symbol reflected the deep hunger for heroes and inspiration within African American communities throughout the antebellum period. In a society that offered few models of black achievement or resistance, Gabriel's story provided proof that slavery could be challenged, that masters were not invincible, and that freedom was worth any sacrifice. Songs were composed about the blacksmith who forged weapons of liberation, and his hammer became a symbol of the power to reshape an unjust world through determination and righteous anger. The image of Gabriel at his forge, sweat glistening on his massive frame as he hammered iron into instruments of freedom, became an enduring metaphor for the transformative power of resistance. Modern historians have struggled to separate the historical Gabriel from the legendary figure, but the essential truth of his story remains clear. He was a man who refused to accept the legitimacy of his own enslavement, and who possessed both the intelligence and courage to act on that refusal. His conspiracy failed due to factors beyond his control, but the very fact that such an elaborate plot could be organized and maintained for months demonstrated the revolutionary potential that existed within every slave community. Gabriel's greatest achievement was not the rebellion he failed to lead, but the example he provided of what was possible when enslaved people refused to accept their condition as permanent or divinely ordained. The legacy of Gabriel Prosser extends into the present day, where his story continues to resonate with anyone who has faced seemingly insurmountable odds in the struggle for justice and equality. His willingness to risk everything for freedom, his refusal to compromise with injustice, and his dignified acceptance of the consequences of resistance make him a timeless figure whose relevance transcends the historical context of early American slavery. In an age when oppression takes new forms and freedom requires new strategies, Gabriel's example reminds us that the price of liberty has always been eternal vigilance and the courage to act when action is required. The hammer he wielded in his forge was more than a tool for shaping metal. It was an instrument for reshaping the world, and its echo still reverberates through the ongoing struggle for human dignity and equality. Richmond never burned as Gabriel planned, but the fire he kindled in the hearts of his people continues to burn, and that may be the greatest victory of all.